Is your anxiety stressing you out? Well, what if I told you anxiety was a gut disorder? Hi, I'm Dr. Arland Hill with Food, Function, Freedom. And guys, today I want to chat with you about anxiety and how the relationship between the gut and anxiety exists. And first, to be able to do that, I need to introduce you to a chemical, and that chemical is called glutamate. And glutamate actually winds your brain up. It stimulates your brain. It actually is associated with anxiety. It makes the anxiety worse. Now, there's also another chemical that I'm going to introduce you to called GABA. And believe it or not, you actually make GABA. GABA is something that the body produces, but in contrast to glutamate, which is excitatory and stimulates the brain, creates that anxiety. On the other hand, you've got GABA. GABA is actually inhibitory and inhibits some of that excess activity in the brain. So think about this very much like a teeter-totter, where on one side you have excitatory stimulation and on the other side you have inhibitory. And you want to keep that teeter-totter in a nice steady state of balance. And if it starts to tip one way or the other, we either call that depression because it's too low, or we call it anxiety because it's too high. There's too much excitatory activity, and that can come from this chemical called glutamate. Now, what you want to know about this is that glutamate can actually convert over to GABA. So believe it or not, your body doesn't want to keep glutamate around. It wants to actually take that glutamate, use it as it needs it for various activities throughout the body, but not allow too much of it to build up, and it does that by converting it over to GABA. Now, to be able to make that happen, there's an enzyme that's called GAD65. And GAD65 is going to convert that glutamate over to GABA, but for that enzyme to be efficient, it's going to require B6, and in addition to that, it's going to require magnesium. So if you have a deficiency in B6 or magnesium, you're not going to be able to make that conversion efficiently, which means that you're going to get stuck over here on glutamate, and that glutamate is, again, what's causing too much stimulation to the brain, and it's not going to go to GABA, which is going to calm the brain back down. Now, there's another piece to this conversation that you need to know about, and that's this amino acid named glutamine. The glutamine is something that can be derived from the diet. However, when we talk about it in the context of glutamate, one of the things that, again, we want to do is be able to convert this glutamate off to areas where it's not overstimulating the brain. Well, going to glutamine is one of the ways that we can also do that. However, just as we saw with the GAD65, where we need the B6 and the magnesium, to be able to get glutamate up to glutamate up to glutamine, that's going to require an enzyme called glutamine synthetase. Now, glutamine synthetase is a manganese-dependent enzyme. So if you don't have adequate manganese, then you're not going to be able to make that enzyme work efficiently, and therefore you won't take that glutamate and convert it back up to glutamine. So you get stuck at this glutamate, winds the brain up too much. Not an ideal scenario to have happen. Now, there's a couple of other things you need to know about in this process to be able to deal with your anxiety here. First of all, what's going to stop you from getting from glutamate to GABA other than just having a lack of B6 and magnesium? Well, in addition to that, when that enzyme is not functional, that can also be caused by gluten in your diet. Yes, the actual consumption of gluten mimics that enzyme, and as a result of that, your body will not allow, or if your immune system starts attacking gluten, it'll also start potentially attacking that enzyme. So if you're eating gluten in your diet and you're dealing with anxiety, get the gluten out of your diet. It's a known correlation, it's a known problem, and you're only putting yourself at further risk and increasing your anxiety. Why take the chance? In addition to that, when I mentioned this enzyme, this glutamate synthetase that goes from glutamate up to glutamine, what affects that enzyme? What would potentially stop that conversion? Well, look at how big of a problem we've got here. Toxins in your environment, toxins in your food that you're being exposed to, and I'm going to pick one specifically here, glyphosate, which is what you probably associate as Roundup that you would say, for example, put on your lawns to kill weeds. It's a weed killer is how we commercially think about it, but it's also very heavily used in the agriculture industry, and as a result of that, It does several things here. One is that it's going to bind up manganese. It doesn't allow manganese to have an efficient role in the body. It doesn't allow magnesium to have an efficient role in the body. So it's actually limiting the utilization of both of those. And in addition, it damages the bacteria, those probiotics in your gut that should be working for you and that are a huge component of your gut-brain axis. It's inhibiting the activity of those particular probiotics, which means that they're not producing GABA for you. Now, did you hear what I just said? Your probiotics, those organisms in your gut that should be there, actually produce GABA for you, which means they're producing an anti-anxiety for you. So if you don't have adequate activity of those probiotics, then you're not going to have sufficient GABA, and you're much more likely to be dealing with anxiety, or your anxiety is even worse than what it should initially be here. Shouldn't be dealing with anxiety on the surface anyway. But glyphosate contributes to that. Other toxins contribute to that because they kill off those bacteria. What makes this worse? Infections. If you're harboring infections in your GI tract, they're not allowing those probiotics to do their job, and then just simply reduced numbers of the probiotics are not going to create sufficient amounts of GABA for you either. So here's what you should be thinking on this. What's next? How do I know which of these is a potential issue for me, and how do I become proactive and take steps to target my anxiety and to begin to deal with it? Well, right up top, you got to know whether or not you're reactive to gluten. If you're showing a reaction to gluten, then you're definitely having an increased risk for not being able to convert that glutamate over to GABA. So that's going to be a problem for you right up front. Next thing you want to know is, are you toxic? Listen, let me put this in perspective for you. There's more toxins in our environment now and in our food supply than there ever has been before. So if you're not taking proactive steps to try to eliminate those toxins or avoid sources of those toxins in your diet, there's no question you're toxic, and you need to go through a process to eliminate those toxins out of your body. You need to detox, and there's very specific ways to go about detoxing, especially as it relates to some of these chemicals we've been referring to here. Now, the next question you want to ask, do you have an infection? Again, why are these infections so important? Well, quite simply, if you have an infection, that's limiting the activity of the probiotics in your gut. Now, think about it this way. I'm going to simplify this just a little bit, but when we talk about the probiotics in the gut, think about those as the good guys. When we talk about these infections, think about those as the bad guys. There's a balance that has to take place there. It's not quite that simple, but just it makes a good way to think about it conceptually. So there's a balance that has to take place there, and if there's a higher prevalence of these infections, if they're more active, then the good guys aren't going to be able to do what they're supposed to do. And remember, what you're looking for from them is going to be GABA production. The more active they are, the less they have to deal with infections, the more GABA they can produce for you, which is going to be your body's own natural anti-anxiety. And that B6 that I mentioned that helps you get from the glutamate to the GABA, that's also produced from your probiotics in your gut. So you need those guys working for you. So last question you want to ask is my bacteria producing GABA for me? If you can answer those questions, you're going to have a huge step forward on being able to deal with your anxiety. You can't get to the root of anxiety without starting to look in the gastrointestinal tract. Listen guys, I appreciate you taking the time. I'm Dr. Arland Hill with Food Function Freedom.